His last wish before execution, to see his dog. But what happened changed everything. The walls of Angola prison sweated under the Louisiana heat, the air inside thick with dust, sweat, and silence. Beyond the razor wire, the Mississippi curled sluggishly past, a reminder of a world just out of reach. In cell block C, Mason Reed sat on the edge of his cot, wrists cuffed, eyes hollow, but steady. 5 years behind bars had carved away everything except endurance. Tomorrow, they would strap him to a gurney. Tomorrow, they would inject the poison that would still his heart. Officially, he was a murderer, the man who had slit the throat of Victor Montgomery, a wealthy businessman with enemies everywhere. Unofficially, he was something worse, a soldier betrayed by the very justice system he had once sworn to protect. The guards had asked him about a last meal. He'd refused. About a priest? He'd refused that too. But when they asked about a final request, his voice cracked for the first time in years. "My dog," he whispered. "I just want to see Ranger." And so, on the final morning, beneath the gray wash of dawn, the cell door clanged open. 2 guards led Mason into the visiting chamber, chains rattling against his ankles. Waiting there, tail stiff, muzzle gray with age, but eyes burning like fire, was a German shepherd who had once served beside him in deserts half a world away. Ranger. The dog barked once, sharp and cutting through the silence. Then he lunged forward, straining against the leash, pressing himself against Mason's knees. The soldier dropped to the floor, chains clattering, his hands trembling as they buried themselves in the thick fur. For the first time since his arrest, Mason broke. His chest heaved, his face pressed against Ranger's neck, tears streaking into the coarse hair. The room blurred, the guards shifting awkwardly, no one daring to speak. Then Ranger did something strange. He nosed sharply at Mason's prison shirt, pawing insistently at the breast pocket, again and again, until threads tore loose. The guards exchanged looks. Mason frowned through his tears. Inside the pocket was nothing but a scrap of fabric from the jacket he'd been wearing the night of Victor Montgomery's death, the only piece of clothing he had been allowed to keep. Ranger's teeth tugged at it, his growls deepening. He wasn't just seeking comfort, he was trying to tell them something. Detective Warren Harlo, standing at the back of the room, stiffened. He had been the one to arrest Mason 5 years ago. He had been sure of his guilt. But now, watching the dog's strange insistence, doubt cut through him like a blade. What was hidden in that scrap of cloth? The question hung in the air, heavy, electric. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood. This was not the end of Mason Reed's story. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The story of Mason Reed began long before the prison walls swallowed him. Born in rural Arkansas, he had grown up quiet, stubborn, and fiercely loyal. The kind of boy who fought bullies twice his size if they laid hands on his friends, who carried stray animals home and begged his mother to let him keep them. When he turned 18, that loyalty found its shape in the Navy. Mason enlisted, and by 21 he was a SEAL, trained to move like a shadow through deserts and jungles alike. It was during those years that Ranger entered his life. A German shepherd bred for discipline, Ranger had been assigned to Mason's unit as a K-9 tracker. Together, they learned the language of survival, silent gestures, shared instincts, nights when Ranger's growl was the only warning before an ambush. They trusted each other in ways words could never capture. Mason saved Ranger from a minefield blast, Ranger once dragged Mason out of the rubble of a collapsed building, teeth locked onto his sleeve as gunfire rained overhead. The men of the unit said Mason and Ranger shared a single soul split between man and dog. But wars end, and soldiers return home with ghosts no one else can see. Mason left the service after 12 years, carrying both scars and honors. Ranger was retired alongside him, grayer at the muzzle, but still sharp-eyed, still watching his master as if waiting for the next mission. Mason struggled to adjust to civilian life. He took construction jobs, odd security details, anything to keep the bills paid. Nights were worse, when silence reminded him of firefights and shadows moved like enemies. Through it all, Ranger lay by his bed, a sentinel against nightmares. Victor Montgomery entered Mason's orbit almost by chance. A wealthy developer with a string of enemies and a taste for corruption, Victor had offered Mason a security contract. For a while the pay was steady, but Mason saw too much. Suspicious deals, envelopes exchanged in back rooms, threats murmured to city officials. One night, after a particularly heated argument, Victor was found dead in his penthouse, his throat cut, blood soaking into the marble floor. The police arrived at Mason's trailer before dawn. They claimed a neighbor had seen him leaving Victor's building. They claimed his jacket bore blood traces. And in the twisted logic of the system, a lone ex-soldier with no alibi became the perfect scapegoat. Mason swore his innocence, but the prosecutor painted him as a volatile veteran, trained to kill, who had snapped after a dispute over money. The jury deliberated only 6 hours before convicting him of murder. Through it all, Ranger never wavered. The dog had howled when they dragged Mason from his home, had fought the leash until his throat bled. In court, when Mason was sentenced, Ranger barked so ferociously that bailiffs had to escort him out. For the 5 years that followed, he lived with a foster handler, yet every report said the same. Ranger refused to bond with anyone else. He ate only when shown a photo of Mason, obeyed no command except the ones Mason had once given. It was as if the dog had gone on strike, waiting for his partner to come home. Detective Warren Harlo, meanwhile, had tried to bury his doubts. A career cop in New Orleans, Harlo had prided himself on solving tough cases. But something about Mason's conviction had always sat wrong with him. The evidence was too neat, the motive too thin. The prosecutor's eagerness had felt rehearsed. Still, Harlo had told himself the jury knew best. He had moved on, until that morning in the prison, when Ranger's strange insistence at the fabric in Mason's pocket reopened every doubt he had buried. Now, as Mason sat shackled in a sterile room, his eyes hollow from years of injustice, and Ranger pawed desperately at a scrap of cloth, Harlo felt the first flicker of guilt harden into something sharper. Suspicion. Had they condemned the wrong man? And if so, who had buried the truth deep enough to damn an innocent soldier? The answers, Harlo realized, might lie in the loyalty of a dog who refused to let his master die without justice. The visiting chamber still smelled of bleach and old metal when the guards pulled Mason back to his feet. His chains clinked, heavy as judgment. Ranger whined low, pressing against him one last time before being tugged back by the leash. The moment the distance stretched between them, the German shepherd barked furiously, pawing again at Mason's shirt pocket as though refusing to let him go without leaving a message. Detective Warren Harlo, standing at the edge of the room, couldn't shake what he'd seen. Dogs didn't fixate without reason. Ranger wasn't just seeking comfort. He was pointing, warning, insisting. Harlo stepped forward. "Leave the fabric with me," he said. One of the guards frowned. "It's prison property." "Then log it as evidence," Harlo snapped, his badge lending weight to his voice. "Chain of custody starts now." Reluctantly, the guard handed over the tattered scrap of Mason's jacket, the same one cataloged years ago as part of the murder trial. Harlo held it gingerly. The fabric was stiff with age, faintly stained, but more than that, there was something strange, an unnatural weight in one seam, as though something had been stitched in. He felt it with his thumb, and a chill crawled up his spine. That night, long after the prison gates had clanged shut behind him, Harlo sat in his office under the glow of a single desk lamp. He slit the seam with a scalpel. From the lining spilled a shard of metal, tarnished but unmistakable, a fragment of a Rolex watch. Victor Montgomery's Rolex. Harlo leaned back in his chair, his pulse hammering. The Rolex had been one of the key pieces missing from the crime scene. Prosecutors claimed it had been stolen during the murder, fueling their theory that Mason had snapped in a fight over money. But if this fragment had been sewn into Mason's jacket, the implication was clear. Someone had planted evidence. Someone had framed him. Harlo thought back to the trial, to the smug smile of Assistant DA Philip Krause, the man who had pushed the case with almost religious fervor. Krause had insisted every doubt be swept aside, had painted Mason not as a soldier, but as a weapon too dangerous to live. Harlo had trusted him then. Now, bile rose in his throat. Meanwhile, in the dim of his cell, Mason replayed Ranger's behavior over and over. That insistent pawing, the growl in his throat. Ranger had known. Somehow, his dog had carried the truth all these years when no one else would. Mason lay awake on the cot, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, whispering to himself. "You never gave up on me, did you, boy?" His chest tightened. For the first time in years, the hopelessness inside him cracked, and through it flickered something dangerously close to belief. 2 days later, Harlo returned to Angola. He entered the visitation room carrying a folder thick with papers. Mason was led in, shackled, his eyes wary. The detective dropped the folder on the table. "Your dog may have just blown this case wide open." Mason narrowed his eyes. "You expect me to trust you? You put me in here." Harlo didn't flinch. "I did my job, or I thought I did. Now I'm not so sure." He opened the folder to reveal photographs, the Rolex fragment, lab reports, inconsistencies in the chain of custody. "This was in your jacket, buried in the seam. No way you put it there." For a long moment, Mason stared at the photos. Then he closed his eyes, exhaling a breath that shook. "Ranger tried to tell you that?" "No," Harlo said quietly. "He tried to tell you, and you listened. That's why we're here." It was not trust, not yet, but it was the first fragile thread of connection. Two men divided by a conviction, united by a dog who refused to accept defeat. And in that fragile connection lay the spark of something dangerous, hope. The walls of Angola swallowed sound, but memories slipped through cracks no guard could seal. Mason Reed sat alone on his cot, the folder Harlo had shown him still burning in his mind. The Rolex fragment, the planted evidence, it had cracked open the vault of 5 long years of silence. As the hours stretched, the past returned, sharp and relentless. He had been 21 when the Navy stamped his orders. A farm boy with shoulders built on hauling hay, he'd gone where few dared, Bud S training, the crucible that turned ordinary men into SEALs. He'd passed with bruises, broken bones, and a will like iron. Ranger had been paired with him during a deployment to Afghanistan, a 2-year-old German shepherd with a bite as fierce as his focus. Mason still remembered their first mission together, stalking through the dust of Helmand Province, when Ranger froze at a doorway. Mason trusted him, held the squad back, and seconds later, an IED detonated inside. The dog had saved half the unit with a single pause. They grew inseparable. Ranger learned Mason's rhythms, when fear coiled in his gut, when exhaustion bent his shoulders, when grief shadowed his face after comrades fell. The dog didn't speak, didn't need to. One press of his muzzle, one steady gaze, and Mason could breathe again. On the worst night, when mortar fire collapsed a wall and pinned Mason beneath rubble, it was Ranger's teeth that gripped his sleeve, Ranger's claws that dug into the dirt until help arrived. "You saved me," Mason had whispered, half-conscious, blood in his throat. "You always save me." But war left scars no training prepared them for. Mason rotated home after 12 years, medals heavy in a box, nightmares heavier in his head. Civilian life felt like a costume that never fit. Construction jobs, security contracts. They paid the bills, but none quieted the ghosts. His wife had left during his deployments, unable to wait out the silence of distance. His parents had died years before. Ranger became his anchor, the one piece of the war he could still hold on to. It was Victor Montgomery who unraveled that fragile stability. Wealthy, cunning, a man with fingers in every dirty deal from New Orleans to Baton Rouge. He'd hired Mason for private security, but it quickly became clear the job was less about guarding lives than shielding secrets. Mason had planned to walk away. Instead, Victor ended up dead, and Mason, with his record and his proximity, made the perfect scapegoat. The trial had been swift. Prosecutor Philip Krause painted him as a killer addicted to violence, a soldier who couldn't let go of war. Ranger's loyalty had been mocked in the courtroom, dismissed as animal instinct rather than evidence of character. Mason had sat in shackles as 12 strangers decided his life was forfeit. Through it all, Ranger's eyes never left him, burning with a faith that no verdict could extinguish. But Harlo carried ghosts too. Long after leaving the prison that day, he found himself driving aimlessly through New Orleans' rain-slick streets. He remembered the night Victor Montgomery died. The crime scene had been too neat. Blood pooled in convenient arcs, the Rolex missing, Mason's jacket suspiciously easy to find. Harlo had felt the prickle of unease, but Krause's voice had been steady, convincing. "You've got your man, detective. Don't let sympathy for a soldier cloud your judgment." Harlo had swallowed his doubts. He told himself justice had been served. Now, staring at the Rolex shard, he saw not justice, but betrayal. Of Mason, of the badge Harlo wore, of the oath he had taken. He returned to his small apartment that night, where the photos of his own past stared down from the walls. His wife, gone 10 years now. His son, a Marine who never made it home from Fallujah. Harlo had buried himself in work because work was the only thing that dulled the ache. And yet, in Mason's story, in Ranger's unyielding loyalty, Harlo felt a mirror of his own failures, the people he hadn't saved, the truth he hadn't fought for. Meanwhile, Ranger carried his own hidden tragedy. The foster families who had taken him during Mason's imprisonment reported the same story. He would not bond, would not obey, would not settle. Nights were spent pacing the door, waiting for footsteps that never came. His muzzle had gone gray, his gait stiff, but his eyes never dulled. Every time Mason appeared in court, Ranger's entire body had strained forward, desperate to reach him. He had endured 5 years of separation with the same discipline he had once endured firefights. Dog, soldier, detective, their pasts wove together like threads of the same torn cloth. All three had been betrayed by the systems they trusted. Mason by the courts, Harlo by his conscience, Ranger by the silence of abandonment. And yet, when they met again in that prison chamber, something in their brokenness recognized itself in the others. As Mason lay on his cot, eyes closed against the buzz of fluorescent lights, he whispered into the stillness, "5 years, boy. You waited 5 years." He pressed his forehead to his chained hands. "I won't waste what you gave me. Not again." The tragedy was heavy, but within it burned the faint outline of salvation. For the first time, Mason felt the weight of his past, not as a shackle, but as the fuel for what had to come next. Because Ranger had found the truth buried in fabric, and Harlo had found the guilt buried in his conscience. Together, they might just dig up the one thing Mason had been denied for half a decade: freedom. The clock was merciless. Mason's execution date was less than 2 weeks away. Appeals had been exhausted, motions denied. To the state, he was just another inmate on death row. To Ranger, he was the only person in the world who mattered. To Detective Warren Harlo, he was a man standing on the edge of a grave dug by lies. Harlo sat in his office long after midnight, the Rolex shard glinting under a desk lamp. He had already run it through forensics, traces of blood matching Victor Montgomery, scratches consistent with being torn loose during a struggle. It was the missing piece, the evidence suppressed. Krause had buried it, and Harlo now realized why. The case had been rotten from the start, but exposing it would not be easy. The prosecutor was now a rising star, tipped for state attorney general. If Harlo accused him of misconduct without airtight proof, his own career would end in ruin. Worse, Mason would still die. So Harlo dug deeper. He pulled sealed files, bribed a clerk for access to the evidence locker. There, he found the second autopsy report, stamped confidential. It contradicted the state's case entirely. Time of death off by hours, wounds inconsistent with Mason's supposed weapon. The report should have been turned over to the defense. Instead, it had been buried. Meanwhile, in the prison yard, Mason walked in circles, Ranger at his side under special allowance from the warden. The dog's presence had changed him. Other inmates noticed the difference. The haunted look had softened, replaced by a grim resolve. Mason bent down, whispering to Ranger, "You knew all along, didn't you? You knew they set me up." The shepherd pressed his muzzle into Mason's hand, as if confirming it, but their time together was rationed. Each visit ended with Mason shackled, dragged back to his cell, and Ranger straining against the leash until his throat rasped. Every goodbye cut deeper than the last. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Harlo tracked down a warehouse guard who had worked for Victor Montgomery. The man, jittery and hollow-eyed, finally cracked under pressure. "It wasn't Reed," he confessed. "It was Wilson Grant, Montgomery's business partner. Things went bad. Reed was supposed to take the fall. Krause made sure of it. Wilson Grant, A name that had circled the case for years but never landed. Wealthy, ruthless, the kind of man whose shadow stretched over courts and council chambers alike. And now Harlo had a witness tying him to the murder. He called the governor's office at dawn, demanding a stay of execution. "I have proof," he insisted, "fabricated evidence, suppressed reports, a witness ready to testify. You execute Reed, and you'll be executing an innocent man." The governor's aide stonewalled him. "Unless you can bring this to court, detective, there's nothing we can do." So Harlo went to court. He filed an emergency motion, dragging the evidence before a weary judge. Ranger was even brought into the chamber, sitting stoic at Mason's side. When the Rolex fragment was displayed, the room fell silent. And when the warehouse guard testified, naming Wilson Grant as the real killer, the silence cracked into chaos. Then came the moment no one expected. From the gallery, Wilson Grant himself stood, red-faced, shouting denials. But the fury gave him away. Under pressure, his words stumbled, broke, and finally spilled into confession. The whole scheme, the bribery, the planted evidence. He admitted what Ranger had known all along. Mason Reed was innocent. The judge's gavel slammed down. The courtroom erupted. Mason sat frozen, his hands shaking, Ranger pressing against his leg as though to anchor him in reality. After 5 years of chains, the tide had turned, but even victory had its shadow. When the trial recessed, Ranger collapsed briefly in the hallway, his body shuddering. A vet was called, and the diagnosis was cruel: late-stage cancer. He had fought too long, carried too much. Mason listened in numb horror as the vet explained there was little time left. Ranger had saved him from death, from despair, from injustice. And now Mason faced a new battle, not for his own life, but for the dog who had given everything to protect it. The first night outside Angola prison felt unreal. Mason stood under an open sky with no bars above his head, the humid Louisiana air filling his lungs without permission or schedule. Reporters swarmed him as he walked through the gates, but he had no words for them. His eyes searched only for the blur of fur pushing through the crowd. "Ranger!" The shepherd barreled toward him, body trembling with effort but eyes blazing. Mason dropped to his knees, arms outstretched. The dog collided with him, and the two clung together, man and beast, as if the years of steel and silence had never passed. Freedom should have tasted sweet, but bitterness crept in quickly. That very night, Mason sat in a quiet motel room, the truth laid bare by the veterinarian who had examined Ranger after his collapse in court. "Hemangiosarcoma," the vet had said. "Aggressive, terminal, a matter of months, maybe weeks." Mason's throat tightened as he stroked the gray along Ranger's muzzle. "After everything you've done for me, this is the thanks you get?" His voice cracked, grief sharpening each syllable. Ranger pressed closer, eyes calm as if telling him, "I did my duty. Now you must do yours." Days blurred as Mason fought a battle of a different kind, against time. He used part of his compensation settlement to bring Ranger to a specialty clinic. The surgeons discovered something extraordinary during exploratory surgery. Lodged near the tumor was a corroded piece of metal, the Rolex fragment. Ranger had carried it inside him all these years, swallowing the shard during the night of Montgomery's murder, when it had been planted on Mason's jacket. He had hidden the evidence the only way he knew, protecting his master even at the cost of his own body. Mason wept openly in the waiting room when the vet explained, "Your dog didn't just save your life once, he's been saving it every day since." The governor himself attended the next hearing, presenting Ranger with the state's Medal of Courage. Cameras flashed as the shepherd, weak but proud, rested his head against Mason's leg while the ribbon was draped over his neck. Applause thundered, but Mason heard only the steady rhythm of Ranger's breathing, each inhale a gift, each exhale a countdown. One evening, Mason drove to the coast. He had promised Ranger the ocean years ago in whispered jokes during deployments overseas. Now he carried him across the sand, the dog's weight heavy but welcome in his arms. He set him down near the surf where the waves lapped cool around his paws. Ranger lifted his head, ears twitching, eyes fixed on the horizon. Mason knelt beside him, pressing his forehead against Ranger's. "You saved me, buddy," Mason whispered, tears slipping down his cheeks. "Not just from a prison. You saved the part of me I thought was gone forever." The waves roared like applause, the sky burned with the last light of day, and for a moment there was nothing but the sound of a man and his dog breathing in unison. Two survivors bound by loyalty, stronger than death. The weeks that followed were a gift Mason never took for granted. Ranger moved slower each morning, but his spirit never dimmed. Neighbors stopped by to bring food, children slipped him treats, and veterans came just to rest a hand on his head. Wherever he lay, on Mason's porch, at the park, or in the sand, Ranger drew people close, as if his loyalty radiated outward, binding strangers into something like family. Mason spent every moment beside him. He carried Ranger when the walks grew too long, lifted him into the truck for drives through pine-lined back roads, even shared his bed at night, the dog steady breathing a rhythm Mason had learned to rely on. The nightmares that had haunted him since war and prison eased, when they came, Ranger's paw pressed against his chest would guide him back. On Ranger's last morning, the sky blazed orange over the Gulf. Mason spread a blanket on the beach, the same stretch of sand where Ranger had once stood with paws in the surf. The shepherd lay with his head in Mason's lap, eyes half-lidded, the Medal of Courage resting beside him. Mason stroked the gray fur along his muzzle, his voice steady, though his heart cracked. "You kept your promise, boy. You never left me. Now it's my turn. I'll carry you the rest of the way." When Ranger's breathing slowed, Mason leaned close, whispering the words he had saved for this moment. "Rest easy, partner. You're free." The waves seemed to hush, the world pausing as Ranger's chest lifted once, twice, then stilled. Mason buried him on a rise overlooking the sea, a simple wooden marker carved with the words, "Ranger, loyal until the end." But the story did not end in grief. With the settlement money, Mason founded the Ranger Foundation, dedicated to supporting retired K-9s and wrongfully convicted veterans. At its ribbon cutting, children ran with German Shepherd pups across the grass, their laughter carrying into the sky. Mason stood at the podium, medal in his hand, voice thick. "Not all heroes wear uniforms," he said. "Some walk on four legs, asking for nothing but love and giving everything in return. Ranger was my proof that loyalty outlasts injustice, that hope can survive even death row. This foundation is my promise that no dog, no soldier, no innocent soul will be left behind again." That evening, Mason returned to the beach. The tide whispered against the shore, and for a fleeting moment, he swore he heard Ranger's bark carried on the wind, sharp, strong, defiant. He smiled through his tears, standing tall against the horizon, because though his partner was gone, Ranger's paw prints had already carved themselves into his life, guiding him toward light And Mason Reed, once a condemned man, now walked free, not just in body, but in spirit.